Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Micah, and today we are going to do our June wrap-up. So I read 5 books for June. I was pretty happy with myself. That was more than May. And I think that's going to be my new goal, is to try to at least read 5 books a month, but we'll see how that goes. And I know a lot of other booktubers, you'll see them now, they read 10, 15, 20 books, but I'm probably never going to be able to read that much in a month because I really need to focus on one thing at a time. So let's jump into it. So our first book today is A Curious Guide to London, Tales of a City, and this is by Simon Leyland. So this is a nonfiction. I actually read 2 nonfiction books this month, and that's pretty rare for me, so kind of an interesting reading month. This is something I got at the British Museum when I was in London in May. And what this is, it is a bunch of kind of like quirky stories about the city of London, and it's a really fun little book. I gave it 4 stars. The reason I gave it 4 stars, it did what it set out to do. It told me some curious things about London, and it did a great job of that. The way it was laid out was really awesome. The stories themselves were interesting, but my cat just jumped up and almost knocked everything off the table. Sorry. But I wasn't like on the edge of my seat like when I went to bed, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I feel like reading it tonight. So that's why it's 4 stars instead of 5. But I really loved this book. I really did. So let's look at what I wrote down for this book. One thing I like is that it's split into different sections of London. So, for example, and I'll kind of put it up, like it has like different sections like Piccadilly Circus, the Embankment, all sorts of things, so that if you stayed in a certain area, you can read the specific stories about that area, or if you visited, like if that was your favorite part of the city. So I really liked how it was organized. It has a little map, and it has the exact like address of it. So if you ever like go back to London, you can look and see exactly where that happened. So I thought that was really awesome. The stories are, a mix of quirky. There's some funny ones. They're informational. It really spans all over, so it's pretty entertaining. My favorite story was the one where there was said to be a ghost, and in one of the abandoned like tube stations, like the line that went to the British Museum that no longer exists. It was supposed to be like the ghost of an Egyptian princess, and there were rumors that if you followed the line, it like opened up into the Egyptian room, which of course the British Museum, denies. They said there's no tunnel that leads it. But I just thought that was a fun little story. And I also learned that Ho Chi Minh, so if you've studied the Vietnam War, Vietnamese history, important figure in that, he like was a pastry chef. Like he studied as a pastry chef in London. And it's just interesting because you think of these people like rooted. You're like Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam War, Vietnam. But before they were contributors in whatever part of history they're part of, they were regular people, and he was in London and he studied under a pastry chef. So I thought that was a pretty fun fact. So if you ever encounter upon this and you have been to London, you want to visit London, you find London history interesting, go for this. But I really did enjoy this book. So that was book number 1. Book number 2 was The Wolf and the Woodsman by Reid. I absolutely loved this book. I gave this 5 stars. So this is 5 stars. So the plot of this is there is a girl, her name is Agatha. She lives in a pagan village, and it's supposed to be like Eastern Europe. It's not like the setting's not an actual Eastern European town, but that's like the vibe, and it even says it on the back cover. And she's a pagan, and there is this religion called the Patra faith. And so basically it's supposed to be like Christianity. And the pagan girls, one girl has to be sacrificed every so often so that they can continue to live the way they do. And then one day the seer of the tribe, she has a vision, and she's realizing that the other young seer, who is our nemesis of Avika, our main character, that they're planning on taking the young seer, and the older seer is like, we cannot afford to lose you. So they take the girl Avika, and she's never been at risk by being chosen. to be sacrificed, and the people who take them away, they're called the Woodsman. She's never been at risk because you have to have powers to be taken away, and she's never had power. She's always been an outcast in her own community. So they kind of put her up like a lamb for slaughter. They disguise her to look like the young seer, and then she goes on this journey, and it's a really great discourse on religious theism, biculturalism, and cultural appropriation. This was an excellent, excellent book. There's a little bit of a romance. There's a romance between Agatha and a woodsman. His name is Gaspar, and we kind of find out some secrets about him later. It's a very slow burn, definitely enemies to lovers. If anyone's worried about smut, I mean, there's like one little scene, but it really doesn't say anything in particular. But there is a little bit of a romance. It was hard for me to get into the romance because it describes the character. So he's missing an eye. He has an eye patch, and I'll put a thumbnail in the top corner. But I just pictured the guy from Alice in Wonderland. It's the actor who was in Back to the Future. That's all I could picture for some reason. So I really couldn't get into it. The romance part, but it is such an interesting discussion on religion. So the patrifaith, that's supposed to be Christianity. It also mentions someone called the Yuli people, which is the other half of Evika's lineage. So her mother was a pagan and her father was a Yuli man. And that is, that represents the Jewish people. And then also it talks about a group called the Mazani. And I kind of liken that to Muslim nations. And just the little details, if you know anything about like medieval history, pagan history, Eastern European history, it's kind of easy to point some stuff out. Like the patrifaith, it talks about kind of like there's, the ultimate God, but then there's also like someone like Satan, so it's in Christianity. It talks about like their symbol is a trident, so it's kind of like three-pronged. So if you think of Catholicism, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Yuli people, it talks about a lot of their traditions. The history is similar. And then kind of the Mazani people, like I kind of got a connection between like places like Constantinople, on the edge of Europe, and then like the Arab conquests, like the 800s or so. So really, for someone such as me who's really into history, those connections were really awesome. And, and also the way these groups are treated. So like the Patrifaith, that's like the official religion. And anyone who's not the Patrifaith, they are at risk of being treated poorly. And like the Yuli, like in a lot of Jewish history, Jewish people haven't been embraced by, the Christians or pagans. By the pagans, they view them as people who just serve the Patrifaith, and the Patrifaith, the Christians view them as other. And this isn't saying anything poorly about Christianity or any religion. I'm just talking about things that have happened throughout history. So please don't get offended, because I'm not trying to poo-poo on anyone's religion whatsoever. And so also, like, what are some other things? And also it talks about cultural appropriation. Like there's this scene where Agatha, she eventually ends up in like the Patrifaith city, and in it, like there's all these chieftains of different sections, so kind of like lords in a medieval time, and they each come out and they have an animal that is responds to their symbol of their land, and that symbol comes from when all these places were pagan. So really, it's taking those traditions of the pagan traditions and putting the patrifaith on them, and kind of, culturally appropriating, like how the Catholic Church did, when they turned some pagan holidays and they put their stamp on it. All right, so that was a really interesting parallel. This was such a good book. This is very dark. There's a lot of violence in this, so definitely look up content warnings. Also, there's a lot of self-mutilation, because it's kind of that old idea of like blood is the connection to power. Like Agatha, she eventually, she doesn't have any power, but in the mythology that she's given, there's kind of like an underworld god. So she like sacrifices her finger, and then she gets like the powers that underworld god had. So there's a lot of self-mutilation, and also in this book, the Patrifae, so like the Christians, they can perform certain powers, but they do have to like mutilate themselves. So if that's something that's going to disturb you, definitely maybe steer clear of this one. But there is a lot of stuff in that, and it is a lot of dark, and there's a lot of tales of abuse. So Vika, she has never fit in anywhere. Like, sure, when her mother was taken, so her mother was one of the girls taken, um, the pagans told her Yuli father that she was dead because they didn't want him coming around because they did not like that her father was Yuli. So she was kind of an outcast. She was abused, I would say abused by the older seer who took her in and just like, and there's kind of like, I wouldn't say SA, but it's like really traumatic sexual experiences. So just look up the content warnings for this. But I did really, even though it's very dark and there's some disturbing things, I really enjoyed just the kind of comment about religious zealism and cultural appropriation. And there's a character that really represents someone who is a tyrant, who's charming and everything, but as soon as he gets that power, he uses every argument he can to stay in power, and then he kind of betrays the people who are around him. So this is a really great book, but like I said, look up the content warnings because there's some heavy stuff in here. But I really, really enjoyed it. Okay, next up we have our second nonfiction, and this is Diary of a Tuscan Bookshop. This is a memoir, and this is by Alba Donati. So I gave this 3 stars, and part of that, this wasn't my favorite, but part of that's my fault. First of all, I got this when I went to Bath in the UK, and I thought this was a novel about someone opening up a bookshop. I wasn't expecting it to be a memoir, so that's on me. I realized I've been doing that lately. Like when I went to that library book sale, I thought a book was about something else because I just like briefly glanced, and yeah. So it's part of it's my fault. I'll say that. But some things I didn't like is the writing is very scattered thoughts. Like it does all center about this woman's town and her opening up this bookshop in Italy in like a town of 180 people. But it goes off on different tangents, and she'll introduce people and kind of give a brief introduction, but not really explain. Or sometimes she just talks about people she knows and doesn't explain. So it can be really hard to follow. And there were some points that she brings up that I wanted a little bit more depth. And granted, this is a memoir, this is her life story, so she is allowed to share only what she's comfortable with, and that's fine. I 100% respect that, but as a reader, it was just kind of like all over the place. There were a bunch, this has been translated, there were a bunch of Italian names to remember. It was a little bit difficult to read. The language was really beautiful though, and she did have some interesting lines in here that I really liked, and this is a book for someone who loves books and bookstores. So I did like it. It's just there were some things I wanted more of, but I understand, she's willing to give what she's willing to give, and just the way it was laid out was a little bit hard. But I gave this 3 stars. All right, next up, we have The Unforgiven by Heather Graham. This is apparently, according to my notes and Goodreads, number 33 in the Crew of Hunters series. So I guess this is one of those mystery series where you don't really need to read any of the other ones. So I actually got this from my stepmom. She was getting rid of books, and every time she does that, she gives them to me because she knows I love to read, and I appreciate it. And the premise of this looked interesting. So it's about this girl. I think her name's Kate. Yeah, Kate. And her parents are murdered when she's really young. And then it's like 12 years later, and like someone else dies in a very similar way in the new town she's in. So it's all about trying to finally catch whoever killed her parents. And so I guess the crux, like the main thing of this series, is that people can see ghosts. So she can see ghosts, our main character. We have a detective who she butted heads with on, actually, when she moves to New Orleans, this is the 3rd case that's similar to her parents. She butted heads with this detective on another case, and so they don't get along, and he sees ghosts. So it's just like people randomly see ghosts, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And then they don't really touch on it. They bring it up a bit, but I mean, this takes place in New Orleans, like one of those spooky haunted cities. And I thought if you're going to introduce a plot point like that, like lean into it, but they did not. It felt like, because I think like the crew of hunters part, those are all people who can see ghosts. And I thought that she just kind of wanted to include the story in her series, so she just put that in. So I was kind of disappointed because it could have been a lot cooler than it was. And also, I did not like the writing style at all. It felt like a middle schooler should write it. Like, I was like, why does this feel familiar? And I'm like, oh, that's how I wrote when I was in 7th grade. Which I'm not trying to, like, she's written like 200 novels, and if you write 200 novels in a short amount of time, there's some things that are going to get sacrificed. And also, like, a character would make a statement and then completely undo that statement. Like, within one sentence, they would say something was happened, but then they would negate the statement they just made. And that happened several times, and it was just hard to keep track after a while. I will say, even though the writing was bad and they should have like really leaned in to that ghost premise, for some reason I couldn't put it down. Like, I hated it, but it was like a car crash where I couldn't look away. And my stepmom gave me another book in the series. I might read it. I don't know, but I had a lot of emotions with this. There was a little love story. It was okay. Like, at first I'm like, oh, that's cool chemistry, but then it just got blah. But 2 stars. But I couldn't put it down. It's odd. Like, I like it, but I hate myself for liking it. I don't know. Alright, and then our final book of the month was Miss Marple, and these are the complete short stories by the Queen of Mystery, Agatha Christie. These were really good. I really enjoyed it. So the premise is there's a woman named Jane Marple, and she's a little old lady that lives in this like little British town, but she's like an awesome little detective. Like the first kind of the first group of short stories is she's having a little party, and all of the people put forth mysteries, and she guesses every one. Like, she's this little old lady in this like little like Victorian frock in the 50s, so she's out of place. But every single time she guesses it right. They're always like, Miss Marple doesn't know what she's talking about. Then she gets it like nail on the head. And I loved that part of it, that people were underestimating her, but she got it every time. Love that for her. Downside was she was always right. Like, I think she's been in novels too, so maybe she's like been wrong at some point, but reading the same like stories over and over where she's right every time, like, it needed to be broken up. Like, really? I mean, this lady's not going to be wrong once. Come on. But what I liked about it is that the reason she can figure these out is just her. She's an astute observer of human nature, and that's how she figures things out. She connects it to people she knows in her little village, and she'll like say it's just like this person doing this, and on the surface it's nothing related to what they're talking about, but if you dig deeper into the why they did that, it all connects. So I enjoyed these. The only thing was, it's a little bit, it's older, it's from like the 50s, 60s, and so some language terms were a little outdated, so there are parts for like what I had to look things up to kind of get it, but I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. I think she's in, I think this character is in other novels, so I might read those novels with her in it. But there is a Marple show on BritBox, and I have got BritBox to watch that show, so I liked it a decent amount. Alright, so those are the 5 books that I read this month. It was a pretty good reading month, a little bit odd because I read so much nonfiction. I used to read nonfiction all the time, but I've just been, for a long time, I've been loving the fiction. So thank you everyone for watching this video. Feel free to comment below. What did you read this month? What was your favorite read? My favorite read was definitely The Wolf and the Woodsman. And my least favorite read of the month was, I can't decide if it's The Unforgiven or I'm going to say Diary of a Tuscan Bookshop, because like the writing was way better in that, but I was like, I just got to get through it. Even though with The Unforgiven it was bad, I still wanted to read it. I don't know. Hate myself for that one, but oh well. Alright everyone, have a great month of July, and I'll see you for my next video. Have a great day.